Hello, welcome back to Modern Papist. My name is Ryan. I'm here with John from Project 101, and today we're going to be talking about answering the critics of Fatima. So, hey, John, could you give a review of what happened at Fatima? Because I know a lot of people are going to know what happened, but for those that don't.
Okay, so I'm assuming that your audience is not going to want a big long recap, so we're going to keep it as concise as we possibly can. Fatima happens in the town or now city of Fatima in Portugal, 1917. Over the course of 6 months, they had 3 shepherd children, all prepubescent, that saw Mary appear to them on the 13th of each month. They were Over that 6 month period, there were a number of people that began to believe what these children were saying. The government in Portugal, being extremely anti-religious and atheistic, trying to support a communist party, locked them up for one of the months, attempted to get them to confess that they were lying under threat of death. None of the children separately confessed that they were lying. They were released on the 6 months, which was October 13th, 1917. The children said that Mary would provide a great sign. 70,000 people had gathered, and the sun began to dance in the sky. After a long rain, the clouds parted, the sun danced, people saw it, and then many people said the sun appeared to be coming down towards the earth. They ran in fear, thinking the world was ending, prayed to God to forgive them of their sins, and then the sun retreated back into its position in the sky, appearing normal. The ground around them was completely dry. This was witnessed by the 70,000 people there and many, many witnesses from the surrounding towns, up to, I believe, the maximum was 30, 35 plus kilometers away.
Right. Okay. So we kind of want to go through. So that's the story of Fatima in a nutshell, I guess. We want to kind of split this up into 2 different avenues here, the physical and the mental. So there's a lot of people who will say, well, there was this physical phenomenon that happened. This goes against reason. And because of this, we can trust that Fatima didn't happen. Or you kind of get this mass hallucination accusation where all these people, including those in the surrounding towns, had this huge hallucination led by groupthink, and that's what happened. So me and John are just going to go over and kind of explain why those don't make sense and why they're just kind of reaching for straw.
Yeah, so I guess we can start with the physical angle. This is what I see most common, is that skeptics don't actually understand what's being claimed as the miracle of Fatima.
Right.
So what they think is that Catholics literally believe that the sun, which is millions of times larger than the earth, flew around and threatened to crash into the ground,
Right.
disrupting the solar system and destroying all life on the planet. Which sounds silly, because it is. But these were big names like Richard Dawkins. These are big names like the editor of skeptics.org, believe that Catholics literally believe that the sun moved around and came down towards the earth, very literally. Again, I've never seen any Catholic claim that the sun literally moved or that the earth literally moved. And so what skeptics will do is they say, well, this would have been observed all over the world and killed all life on the planet, so obviously it didn't happen. And it sounds really laughable and silly because, of course, Catholics are claiming it as a form of vision that people had, in the same way that you might have any divine vision, right?
Right.
So, if you go back to the prophets in the Old Testament and you say, this prophet saw a boiling thing of oil that represented this country, or you saw Stephen, who was stoned to death, when he saw Jesus in the parting clouds. I don't think that somebody is literally going, well, if you had a camera on the clouds didn't move or this or that or whatever. They're claiming it as a physical event because they really don't understand what a Christian vision is. Yeah, I've never had any pope or any Catholic authority ever claim that it was an actual astronomical event that took place.
Right. And it's important to note, like, we will talk about the psychological aspects of this later. We are focusing on the physical right now. Because physical things did happen. Like, all of a sudden, everything was dry when there was a downpour. Like, there are photos of people, the whole crowd having umbrellas as they're waiting in preparation for a predicted event. And so physical things happened. It wasn't just in their minds. It wasn't just in an individual vision to one person. Although in the case of the children, they had a particular, even within the children, I believe the boy wasn't able to. I keep forgetting his name. He didn't have the same vision that the girls did.
Right.
But the understanding that the physical effects of the miracle still happened, as if the sun did come closer to the earth. That's why it was dry. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so let's and I want to read this because people might think we're making this up. This is from Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, so that we see, this is what skeptics are arguing against. They're creating a straw man, is essentially what it is.
Right.
On the face of it, mass visions, such as the report of the 70,000 pilgrims at Fatima in Portugal in 1917, saw the sun tear itself from the heavens and come crashing down upon the multitudes, are harder to write off. It's not easy to explain how 70,000 people could share the same hallucination. Great point, Richard Dawkins. But it is even harder to accept that it really happened without the rest of the world outside of Fatima seeing it too. And this is where we get into his straw man. And not just seeing it, but feeling it as the catastrophic destruction of the solar system, including acceleration forces sufficient to hurl everyone into space. Obviously, the sun did not dance and plunge to the earth. We know the sun is billions of times bigger than the earth. If the sun plunged to the earth, there would be no earth. Clearly, there was no miracle of the sun at Fatima.
Right.
And it's just, it makes me smile, and I'm not trying to be mean to the guy, but it's just so silly. But he's right in what he says. Hey, look, if there was a vision, which is what we're claiming, shared by 70,000 people, that's super hard to explain. And so Dawkins has to create a straw man to not say, hey, look, Fatima just must be true, because we don't have anything else like that in history. So let's touch on it first psychologically. Because what's argued, I've heard different arguments say, well, this must have been a bunch of believers, dumb, uneducated people just begging God for a miracle, ready to believe anything in the world. And all 70,000 of them were Bible-believing, Bible-thumping Catholics who just wanted to believe these children and trick themselves into seeing something. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, you got to add also during a desperate time in Portugal.
Right.
So this is prior to World War I, as it's actually, well, it's prior to the end of World War I. So that's a very important point. The First World War is going on. So there's desperation going on, and I mean, it would be hard to argue. I don't know, from the knee-jerk reaction that I think a lot of people today would give is this mass hallucination understanding that there's, all right, so you have someone, leading the group, and they're riling the group in such a way that they're very charismatic. Like, you got to add that they have to be charismatic to do this, and that they're spinning what the people have in their minds to what the person is trying to get them to believe. And that to me is crazy, because the girls, specifically Lucia, did not talk that much. She did say stuff, but she did not talk that much. She just she was not charismatic. And she was very much like subordinately responding to what Mary was telling her.
Right.
If that makes sense, because it's like it wasn't like she was commanding everyone with this like she was to a certain extent commanding people to like, all right, take it, remove your umbrellas, I think. But besides that, it was like, or kneel, but like it wasn't with this authority like a
You don't
president
think
or a
like
mayor.
these 9 and 13-year-olds were like corralling the crowd?
I mean, like, yeah, I mean, I can just kind of like imagine my children doing that. I mean, like in front of everyone and just saying like, oh, you know, we believe in God and something amazing is going to happen that we predicted 3 months ago. And something happens. Like, I think that's the important thing is like something does actually happen. Um, and it's not simply just, it's not simply just seen by people. It's also physically there.
Right. So I think the problem with so whenever we talk about the psychological approach, yes, it is ridiculous to imagine children from like 8 to 13 corralling a crowd of 70,000 people into a hallucinatory state. Um, because and all of it just sounds fun. Like I'm trying not to smile because it's just so silly. But yeah, so as hard as that is to imagine, the big thing for me is that there were people outside of the crowd in nearby villages and towns that saw the miracle and weren't expecting to see the miracle, didn't want to see the miracle. And then amongst the crowd, there were people that said, hey, look, we're just coming here on, either to protest the government. That was a big thing at the time. So they were standing in solidarity with religious people. There were people going there as psychologists to study the effects of what might happen, who then also claimed to see the miracle. There were atheist newspapers that reported the miracle. So there are definitely people who went there not expecting to see anything and even expecting to guard themselves against some sort of hallucination that also saw the miracle. There were people that said, hey, I didn't know that was happening today. Man, you reminded me the miracle was happening. And they walk outside and see, the sun plunging down towards the earth. So
Yep.
you pulled a couple of those sources. So if you want to talk a little bit about that in general, the people outside of Fatima.
Okay, so there is let me get the names because I can give you the names. Um so there was a young boy, he was about 9 years old. He saw the miracle with his class outside of town. He was able to see it from afar. His name was Ignacio Lorenzo. And it was a village 12 miles outside of Fatima, where he was located. There is also another gentleman. So there's another gentleman called Denal Foley. I'm sorry, not Denal Foley. That's who researched this. Asking this person, but Alfonso Lopez Vieira. He lived 30 miles away, and he was reminded of the prediction by the actual miracle itself. So he completely forgot about it and was just going about his day. And then all of a sudden he sees towards Fatima the miracle happening. He's like, oh yeah, that's today. Like, I mean, like, that's a crazy thing to say. It's one thing, like maybe the boy had some sort of reminder, like the class was told something, but for a grown man to be like, oh yeah, like that's today, and I'm looking at it, and that's what reminded me.
Right.
That's pretty hard to say, oh, well, he's just making that up. Like, I
Or
mean,
he's
honestly,
psychologically prepared for the miracle.
right. Like he was just going about his day. He saw it.
Yeah.
But like, do you have any, like, I think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I found a few cases like that. They had a woman who, because the government was very against these events. And so one of the women that was interviewed, her husband was an atheist, part of this communist regime. And he said, you're not allowed to go. And she stood out on her roof 20 miles from the location and watched the miracle happen. And her farmhands saw the miracle as well. Now, from her angle, she only saw the sun descending. That's all that she says. So, very clearly a physical or an event or a vision that she wouldn't have been listening to the children talk. She wouldn't know when exactly it would be. Because another thing to remember too, and this is really important, is that the miracle was supposed to happen at noon, but the times in Portugal were not noon, right? So their times were set to the war front, right? So all of their times, I believe it was an hour or 2 hours off because Portugal was trying to win the war, and so they actually set all their clocks to a different time zone. So the miracle happened at solar noon, but not at noon at their time. So anybody who observed it outside of it would have been observing it hours after or hours before the children predicted that the miracle would take place. So if you have a guy walking around, it's not like he's going, yeah, they predicted it at noon and it's noon right now. Let me look. Oh, I thought I saw something there. You would have had somebody going, oh, it's 2 o'clock, not when the kids predicted it. Hey, but that is today, right? So that's another confounding factor, is that solar noon and noon at the time on the clocks in Portugal was different. So the crowd actually just hung out for a little while. This crowd of 70,000 people was waiting at noon, but at solar noon, the event actually took place.
Yeah, I think the time that they have that I read over that cited most of the time is that it happened at 12:45. So like there's like a period of time that waited that happened. The downpour happens, and then everything wrapped up in like 10 to 15 minutes. Like everything that you described happened very fast in terms of like everything you're describing. And I think a lot of people miss like how long it was. It wasn't like instantaneous, and it wasn't and it didn't drag on for hours. So it's kind of like in like a show. Like not to, it's about the size of the show.
Well, this is something though that's important about that too. And this was an argument that I hadn't considered. But let's say you do have people staring at the sun for 10 to 15 minutes. Because another skeptical argument, this is my favorite one of all, is that people looked at the sun, it was really bright, it hurt their retinas. And so when they looked away, they saw that kind of spotty effect that staring at bright light gives you.
Yeah.
And they were so dumb, they just assumed the sun was moving. And it was so convincing that atheists were bowled over by it. But the fact of the matter that the event took 10 to 15 minutes means that, and I had my father actually pointed this out to me. He said, well, then wouldn't you have 70,000 people in Portugal running around with like severe retina damage within like a year or two?
Well, maybe. I mean, maybe not 70,000, but a lot. Like,
well, right. Like if they're just staring at the sun for 10 minutes straight, like this event's happening. And it's a silly thing to bring up, but I mean, in all the accounts, they said that the sun appeared that you could just stare right at it and that you could watch it do what it was doing and without retinal damage. And that's pretty common.
And that I remember reading that too. What's very funny to me is they'll say the looking at the sun. Oh, none of these people went to science class. None of these people have ever grown up before and ever looked at the sun. And this is the first time they've ever looked at the sun and seen this happen. It's like, give me a break. Like at that point, you're pretending, like you're making us, like you're almost saying they're not human. Like the people who are there are not human and don't do human things and understand like I get it that especially a lot of the deep critics. So I say deep critics, but like Dawkins comes like 100 years after the fact.
Right.
There were reporters that went there in the 1960s while the people were still alive and were like, hey, like you were an atheist at this point. Why did you change? Like, why are you now a believer? And it's like, that's missed when you're 100 years removed, as opposed to like a few decades, 20, 30 years removed. And so we have this we have this tendency to make a straw man out of the people that were there. And we have this tendency, especially since the Enlightenment, to make people who were back in the day dumber than what they, or more dumb, more dumb than what they actually were, to justify our confirmation bias. Right.
Well, and that's the other thing that I would say about it. I think that's the most important, and it's the point that we talked about a little bit earlier, is that these were not these were not all religious people. And so, but secondly, just because they're Christian or Catholic or whatever have you, does not mean that they thought they were going to see a miracle, right? So of the crowd, because we're thinking the vast majority of people in this crowd were waiting on a miracle and, hysterical and lunatics. Probably the vast majority of them did not think anything was going to happen in any meaningful way. I mean, that's from reading through about 30, 40, 50 of these testimonies. Like one of them said, we went there to stand in solidarity with the people or just to kind of see what was happening. Like imagine you're in a number of villages in Portugal and you see 70,000 people gathered, which might be bigger than the entire population of your village. And you go, man, I'm going to just go, what's going on over there? Right. And you just kind of stumble in.
We didn't have the distractions we have today.
Right.
People weren't looking at their phones, so they would have been looking around. And then they're like, oh, a huge gathering of people. Let's see what's going on over there.
Well, right. In a lot of ways, and the other big thing too is that there were people that were injured for going. So early pilgrims that showed up, the government was trying to stop them. And they have a guy who says, look, I got this scar from a bayonet from one of the Portuguese atheist regime soldiers that was trying to stop me from getting to the event. So as people started to clamber in and it became apparent that there was just too much, to handle, the soldiers backed off. But the early people there showing up met resistance. Another thing to think about too is the amount of rain that was out there. So that was an important point that you brought up. I have heard it, and it's funny to me because I have heard that skeptics say, well, the amount of rain and the instantaneous drying of everything, it depends on what sources you look at as to whether and how wet they were and how wet the ground was and all that kind of stuff. Therefore, this account is dubious at best. And I'm kind of thinking, well, look, in a crowd of 70,000 people, if you're on the low ground, you're more wet. And if you're on the high ground, you're less wet.
Yeah.
That to me is a silly objection. And I think the ground instantly drying and the people outside of Fatima seeing it are the two strongest indicators that eliminate any psychological explanation.
Right, because at that point, the mass hallucination has been countered. And I guess if something was in the air and everyone was getting high, that's been countered too, because they're being,
no, tell us about that one, because that's my favorite. Or that's my favorite that you've come up with, is the everybody got high one.
I honestly didn't read any that said that. I was just making it up because it just seemed silly. But that's kind of what people that's what they're like, oh, well, mass hallucination is either this or there was something in the air and everyone got high off it and saw something, which is why some people have slightly different accounts. And it's like, no, that's just not how that works. That's not what's being claimed.
Right. So another thing to address is I could not find anything, firsthand sources that said that there were people that didn't see anything. That was something that I found in skeptic websites.
Yeah,
but I never found that in any of my research. I couldn't find it.
Right, I couldn't find it where that was happening. That doesn't mean they don't exist. However, given that we all know skeptics and atheists are all about citations and making sure that everyone knows where everything is, it does seem a little odd that that piece of information isn't there.
Yeah, I never see a direct quotation for it, ever.
Yeah, it's always just a generalized statement. It's always like, well, there's some people who didn't see anything. We can come up with a bunch of stories of real people with real names. That's why I said the names, is because the names matter. Names are very important. You can't just say, well, this person, although I am about to say that because I don't remember the guy's name. So there was a guy, because I've already given you two examples of people being outside of town, but there was a guy there who saw the miracle and it blinded him and he turned around and he still saw the miracle. Like he opened his eyes and he still saw the miracle.
Jeez.
And so like it's the nature, it's the supernatural nature of a divine vision. And it's not, the solar system didn't break that day. Like that's not what's being claimed, like what you said. And it's very important to look at it from that perspective, because when you try to make it, I guess, how you expect it, you're going to be wrong, because there's no unifying theory with any of this. And even if it did, like the amazing thing would be that a group of 8 to 13-year-olds came up with a prediction that had some natural phenomena happened along with a hallucination at the time they said it was, which is, as a statistician, incredibly unlikely that would happen. Like, so like it's the fact that you have so many things going for it in terms of just timing, and that if you're going to account for it with all these, naturalistic explanations, it is incredibly improbable that any of those would happen at the exact same time. Like, so we're talking just absolutely astronomically ridiculous.
As a statistician, though, when you look at the chances of, say, like a mass hallucination happening, because mass hallucination is used as an explanation, but to my knowledge, there's no such thing.
Well, so like there's,
or it's a technical
some people
term being misused.
Yeah, it's I think it's more because like you can. That's why I like brought up charismatic, because like people would say, for example, Adolf Hitler hallucinated and swayed people with his speeches in German. I'm not German, so like whenever I watch it, I'm like, I'm not convinced. But like this idea of you have a crowd and the crowd's all rallying, kind of like a sporting event, and people are just getting into it. And like, I mean, I guess you could say to a certain extent, like, that's it. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems like mass hallucination is just misappropriated in this instance, because the testing for it is very problematic. If you're going to have a name or label for something, it better be more than theory. It better be tested and seen and understood. That's the whole point of science, not to speculate and then make crap up just because you don't like it. And that's what it seems to be in this case. Well, you have this mass hallucination of 70,000 people and surrounding areas of people who were not in the crowd that had no idea it was going on. Like, give me a break. Like, at that point, you're just kind of showing you don't want it to be true. You're not showing anything besides your bias.
Right.
So that's how I would interpret.
Yeah, and it's so, on a personal note, it's very insulting to the people there that were observers.
Right.
It's just like, oh yeah, I'm sorry. Like, imagine if it were the reverse and you said, hey, look, I went out to this event, these children predicted it, and I saw a miracle for 15 minutes with the sun dancing in the sky, and they just kind of pat you in the head and go, oh, you fool. It's because you received the Eucharist this week and went to confession. That's why, like, because you're a devout Catholic, you're just too stupid to be a good eyewitness. And you would never use that in any other. That would be like me saying, I'm a fan of this professional boxer and I wanted him to win. So even though he lost, I saw him as winning because I just believed hard enough. And it's like, does that happen on an individual level? Very rarely. Sure. Does it happen on some sort of mass scale?
Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
Like, what it also represents is they're applying a confirmation bias, almost like projection, because they have confirmation bias. It's kind of like the same argument as, well, Jesus couldn't have resurrected, because sorry, I'm thinking whatever. Jesus couldn't have resurrected because people don't do that. And it's like, I think Richard Dawkins said something like that. I was like, that's the whole point. Like, do you not understand the miracle? Like, the whole point is that people don't do that. And like, when things act contrary, and this is the thing, is like with the phenomenon that happened at Fatima, the supernatural event, there are so many things that make it impossible to have a unifying theory with what we understand in science. The people outside of the town is what really does it for me. It's the fact, it's the atheists and the people outside of the town. It's like there's no groupthink with those people. Most of them that witnessed it didn't know, or at least I don't want to say most of them, but a lot of them didn't witness it. And or I'm sorry, they witnessed it, but they didn't know it was happening. They just saw it. And the atheists that went there being like, this is going to be full of crap. Well, they're believers now. And what are you going to do? You're going to say, oh, they're believers now, we can't trust them. It's like, well, no, like, isn't that the whole point? They went, saw, were mentally prepared to say, this is BS. And then they saw something and they're like, well, no, this is like, I'm a Catholic now. Like, I'm gonna go to church now, because like, that's kind of the whole point of a miracle. To reveal God to not only the believers, but especially the unbelievers. So that we're under, they're able to be convinced because of a bunch of things in their life, whatever. There's a whole bunch of reasons why, but.
So I guess the final thing to touch on would be the sun dogs. That was something that was purported, or fire suns. There are different astronomical events in which the sun will look different. So I'm just going to run through those really, really quickly. Actually, and just to kind of put the bias of this out there, Live Science or Live Science, it doesn't give a pronunciation on its website, actually pulled the editor of skeptics.org to do his article. So when you say, oh, the scientific community is totally open to this, well, but anyway, so there's a lot of bias against it. But looking at, say, like perihelia, which are sundogs, we'll just address that really quickly. That's a weather phenomenon in which ice crystals freeze in the air. They form a type of large range reflective surface. So you'll get the sun appear, and then you'll have two partial suns appear at different places. And you can look at it and tell it's an optical event just looking at it, right? Because it looks almost like you have like a disc in the air, and where you're standing, the sun is going through it like a magnifying glass. So you're getting like a light reflection on the edge of it. It's very, very common in Siberia. So if the kids had managed to predict a mid-fall set of perihelia after a rainstorm in Portugal, then the event itself would be a miracle. But it doesn't appear to basically bear any of the qualities that these event talks about, but it has been promoted by different scientists trying to explain it. But the author of skeptics.org even says this doesn't really make any sense. He has to go with a psychological phenomenon, because he says none of the naturalistic explanations really work. Fire suns don't really work. There are white suns where the sun appears as a white disk because it's going through clouds. Just none. I haven't found anything that even looks anywhere close to it.
Right. And like that's what makes this very convincing to a lot of people, is when they look at one explanation from the physical, and then they look at one explanation from the psychological, they're pinning them against each other, because having both of them happen at the same time is just incredibly unlikely. And I think that's actually like a prudential move, because just to compound a bunch of, extraordinary claims like that on top of each other is kind of ridiculous. Like just to try to answer something you don't like. Or to answer something, if they're looking at it from an objective standpoint, they know that by adding more complexity to it, the probability of it happening in a naturalistic sense is going to be astronomical, like ridiculously low. And so they're kind of playing this mental game of which probabilistically is this a miracle or not. And the problem with that is obviously miracles don't have a probability attached to them. Because they're not like natural events, given their nature. So, they're supernatural nature, but you have this instance where this guy says, well, it can't be the physical, so it has to be hallucination standpoint, but the hallucination standpoint doesn't stand up either.
Right.
And so where do they go? Well, I think they just end the article. You know what I mean? Like that's what they do. Is they just end the article like, oh, I just think it's the other thing. And they don't explain in as much detail as the previous one with the natural phenomena. And they just kind of like leave it open-ended and kind of hope you take their word on it.
Right.
And that's like what I have an issue with when it comes to articles like that, because it creates this, it's like appealing to authority without the authority.
Right.
Like, and it's just really lazy. Sorry, that's.
No. I think that's great. And I mean, there's not a whole bunch else to say on it. I find that that's a very common skeptical tactic, is you say, well, this naturalistic event can explain why the sun looked like a white disk. Therefore, it could be this. Well, this psychological thing could explain people seeing things, but it doesn't explain the ground being dry. So it could be this. And basically what they do is when you're looking at Fatima, you're going, okay, explain all 5 factors. And a skeptic goes, I explain 2. We're done. And it's like no.
It's like you've got a list of things to explain.
And that's not how it works, right? And so it's it's one of those. Fatima for the longest time was basically a religious slam dunk. It's only now that we're getting further and further away from the event. Right. And therefore we're saying, well, those were backward, stupid people from the past that were even questioning it. But I don't know of too many contemporary authors that made any form of convincing argument against it. It was more or less just ignore it and hope it goes away.
Yeah, because I mean, like in Catholic circles, Fatima's amazing. I mean, like we get so many things from there, and there's so many devotions to Fatima that, I mean, there should be more devotions to Fatima, because the message is very much about, we need to
pray the rosary and repent and penance.
Well, I mean, like, now we're in a day, like our culture is crazy. Like it's not like atheistic, influence. It's like, it's here. Like we were one of the people fighting against it, and now it's around us. And it's not only around us, but it's seeping into everything we do, and it's mocking and twisting what's true to justify its own ends. And I'm not going to go into all the things about it. I think most people understand what I'm talking about, so I'm not going to just say it because I don't want to risk getting this flagged. So, okay. So, is there any last points that you want to talk about, like state, or is that pretty much it?
I would encourage people, because I talk with a lot of atheists and open them up, and they normally become agnostic at that point. And I've had a lot of those conversations, and I'll use Fatima as one of my examples and just say, look, sit down and look at the evidence with me from a scientific perspective and give me an explanation. And you're not going to win them over in that thing, but just talk it through. Don't say, I got you. Don't say anything. Just present the evidence and then say, explain this to me in a way that explains these all 5 points or all 10 points or however you want to break them up. And when they can't do it, just leave it. Don't go, oh my gosh, I've got you. You now have to believe.
Right. Say, don't.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That there's a miracle here in the 20th century witnessed by 70,000 people. So something equivalent to like the splitting of the sea, right? Which is, I think, would be the most astounding miracle, other than maybe the darkness when Jesus, was crucified, which we're not going to go into, but is actually also in other ancient sources.
Right.
Yeah. So we'll just present it. And the more that you present these, the more that you chip away at that skeptic who says, I don't believe because of scientific reasons. And you can chip away at that and go, what's the real reason that you don't believe?
Right. And Fatima, I think, that miracle in particular is just it's a very good way of evangelizing without, as long as you don't beat it over the head with them.
Yeah.
Because it does plant the seed of doubt in what they trust clearly more than the faith, which is scientific interpretations from people who are against it.
Right.
So, okay. Well, thanks for joining me in this talk. I know, like, I've always really wanted to like go through a lot of these with just talking about it with someone, because I do think there is a lot of conversation about Fatima and all the positive things, all the devotions and what the messages were and everything, but not a lot about going against what people criticize it for. And so that's why we made this. And I'm happy. So thanks for the idea, John, because it was your idea to do it. And he's over at Project 101, where you can subscribe and see his videos on saints and miracles that happen all the time, dating from a long time ago. What is it, like 500, 600 years ago?
Oh yeah,
now
we're just doing all the miracles. Most of them are modern, but yeah.
Right, most of them are modern, but there's some, you know, that date back. But there's some that date back to, you know, a few years ago. So
right.
Please go see it, because those are amazing, amazing to watch. So
thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks for having this conversation. And thanks for watching, guys. Bye.